pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Kyle Lewis Jordan, an early career archaeologist and curator who specializes in the study of disability in antiquity. Born with cerebral palsy, he completed his postgraduate studies in the archaeology and heritage of Egypt and the Middle East at the University College London before going on to curate exhibitions at the likes of the Ashmolean Museum, Pitt Rivers Museum, and the Verulamium Museum. Hill currently continues to research and curate on the topic of disability in antiquity in a freelance capacity. And so today we're actually going to do a little bit of a format break for Raised Diff, which I love to do, which is we at Raised Diff, we love to be experimental and to do things however we like to do them, which is that, in fact, Kyle and I are going to have a more informal kind of conversation based on some questions that he suggested for me, and we are going to have like a more freewheeling conversation about the topic. But the topic, the title of this session is All Our Yesterdays: Why Classics Ancient World Studies Needs a Disability Paradigm. So Kyle, thank you first of all for joining us today. And I should
Thank you
tell
for having me.
everyone that I've been trying to get Kyle into the Raise Diff project for like years, so I'm really excited. This is a big get for me. So welcome, Kyle.
Thank you. It's great to be here, finally.
And so let's start off with the big question then. So tell us
Mm.
about what is a disability paradigm?
That is a great question. So, when I'm talking about a disability paradigm, in contemporary discourse today, there are two predominant models for the ways in which we think about disability. These are often described as the medical model and the social model. To give the audience a very quick run through of what those mean, the medical model situates the issue of disability directly in the body or the mind of the individual who has a specific impairment. So I'll use myself for example. The fact that I have cerebral palsy and therefore need to use a wheelchair means that my inability to walk is inherent within me and my condition, and therefore can only be treated as something directly through me through medical intervention, and is therefore a deficiency when compared to a normative body, mind, or body type. The social model, by contrast, which emerged in the late 20th century as a form of an activist response on the part of a very large movement of disabled people, predominantly in the UK and in the US, was to look at the societal barriers that create disablement. So, instead of the disability coming from my own cerebral palsy, it is the result of the fact that we have built a world in which my inability to walk is not considered. That's a very rudimentary example of how that works. Now, how does that apply then to a paradigm? Well, the slight shift there is that, of course, when we're thinking of models, the models are responding to a particular set of circumstances. So both the medical and social model are responding to an industrialized world where our capacities and capability as human people are measured in that capacity. So again, the fact that I cannot walk is seen as a deficiency in the medical sense, or is seen as a barrier to my larger productivity in the social sense. But of course, that doesn't necessarily translate to a pre-industrial world or to most epochs of human history. So how then do we kind of move beyond that and think about it? And it really comes down to seeing a social cultural lens to disability, recognizing that the impairments that human beings can develop and have had with them throughout human history have been witnessed and understood by cultures throughout time, and therefore how that is recorded, how that is captured, and therefore kind of rationalized both by the viewer, by the other person, and therefore by the person who is then inhabiting that body, can also shape our not just our understanding of that condition, but also how we then move and act through the world. So essentially, what we are looking for in a disability paradigm is not just a model, but a ways of thinking and seeing and acting on that experience. And this is something that can be informed by the application of a discipline known as critical disability studies, which is essentially taking lived experience as a form of knowledge, because it is, to then apply to our understanding of how these things interact with a wider network of things, and therefore not falling into the trap of saying, well, this model can't stand in this society because they did not have these sort of economic models that were therefore classifying people in this way, therefore it doesn't work. It's like, well, no, because this lived experience still imprints on the body, so clearly it's still there. How do we begin to see it?
Thank you so much. And I'd like to just ask a couple of follow-up questions if that's all right by
Sure.
you. So this is very clear and helpful. And there seem to be kind of two kind of branches that in a sense may follow from this, which
Mm,
is one, that there is the kind of the constituency of classics or ancient world studies and the ability to serve the disabled scholars, right? And then
mm,
there's the other and the kind of inherent ableism which classicism
mm,
has, been co-opted, been kind of
mm,
entangled with. That's one. And then the
mm,
other is the kind of question of how to be seeing disability in antiquity, especially
mm,
well, given the fact that there is such a kind of we often the turn towards antiquity has been in order to empower supremacist beliefs, and so it kind
mm,
of can invisibilize disabled ancient subjects, or kind of assumptions around disability mean the evidence of disability can be kind of understood along
mm,
aesthetic lines or moral
mm,
lines, right? So those are two very different but connected questions, which is just to repeat one, how does this play out in the constituency of us
mm,
as professionals and students
mm.
and teachers? And then the other is how does it play out in the way that we observe ancient materials?
Mm. No, again, really great questions, and thank you for kind of focusing us down those tracks. Because yes, you're absolutely right that historically the fields of classics and wider ancient world studies, archaeology as a discipline in and of itself, as our previous papers have already kind of noted, there is this sort of inherent binary kind of classification that occurs within the creation of these kind of subsets of data and knowledge that therefore always create an intrinsic opposition. So you have your urban center and your hinterland. You have your empire and your frontier. You have the able body and therefore the disabled body. And this is where the kind of muddy history of classics and other disciplines like Egyptology, for example, muddy with the development of pseudosciences of race and eugenics. And therefore, as you said, leads to this sort of inherent ableism and othering that can occur when, again, the classical sources or ancient sources are extracted to uphold this predominant view of the normative idea of society or civilization, to say that only the most physically perfect or kind of mentally astute could possibly lead humanity through these great changes, and that therefore any exception to that rule is a deviation and something to be critiqued and studied as an aberration, and why there should be a wariness to the other. And I think this is where, when it comes into its application into contemporary classics and the studies today, is that unfortunately you still see this prevailing use of ableist and disableist terminology in the studies. Just like Sally was saying about the language that's used about the Samnites, you do still see this approach to the disabled body and mind as something that is inherently deficient. So when we encounter in the evidence, for example, in the archaeological evidence, we will find someone who has osteoarthritis, or we find someone who has a fused jaw and therefore has had their front teeth smashed through so that they can take in liquid foods. The inherent focus of scholars today, especially bioarchaeologists at times, is to focus on the pain and suffering that can be inherent in those conditions. And of course, we shouldn't discount the fact that, yes, these are inherently painful things that can be experienced. However, one should question the combination between pain and suffering. Someone can experience pain and not necessarily be in any suffering. Likewise, someone can be experiencing suffering with no physical pain. And I think it's that application of more contemporary pathologies to ancient subjects that begins to really unravel immediately how we're actually engaging with them, because then we are already taking our model to them rather than thinking of, well, how did they experience these bodies in this space? Because needlessly, here they are, they lived. And so when we reduce it to just saying, oh, this must have been painful, it can't have been great, we immediately discard asking ourselves the more wider question of, well, here they are clearly being accommodated. They have survived. They have made a life for themselves. Where is their agency in this? And if there isn't any agency in this, then what does that tell us about the wider powers at play? So, for example, how can taking a disability studies or disability paradigm informed approach to the institution of slavery in the classical world change our questions about what it means and how it was instituted and the effects that that has on both the enslaved and even in some ways the enslaver? How could we not see the connection between the fact that if the enslaved are being used to produce quite a lot of manual economic labor, that the enslaver therefore has a higher chance of having a healthy body because they are able to extract that punishing labor from the enslaved? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. And it calls to mind recent work by Clara Bozak Schroeder, who
Mm,
has been kind of problematizing the use of there has been a theory of prosthesis in
mm,
slavery studies for Roman slavery, where the idea is that that's actually to some degree underdeveloped in regards to these
mm,
kinds of questions that you're raising.
mm,
So
mm,
the next big question I have for you, you're touching upon it, but I let's like open up this question even more,
mm.
is that how has classical studies and ancient world studies historically dealt with disability?
It's historically dealt with disability as something of an exception to the rule. Often, when you find either archaeological, bioarchaeological, or artistic or literary references to disability, it is again often prismed through that kind of contemporary framing of disability that the scholar is often conditioned within, because again, within the academy, you have this longer tradition that is in itself based within the institutions of empire and colonizing. Therefore, when they see the other, they immediately problematize it as something of an aberration.
Hmm.
And so, in the classics world specifically, um, as I mean, in academia more generally, I think one of the current challenges you have, in historical and contemporary challenges you have, is that the evidence is experiencing asphyxiation by monograph, where everything is kind of condensed into these large tomes that are only accessed by a few people. And so, therefore, the same evidence is passed around, but never really quite understood in a wider framework of things. So, for example, one of the most classic kind of uh, texts for looking at disability in Greco-Roman antiquity is Robert Garland's The Eye of the Beholder. But The Eye of the Beholder immediately frames all of its evidence that it does. And to its credit, the one thing it does is give a very large catalogue of evidence, which is very useful to reflect on. Unfortunately, Robert Garland wears his disableism on his sleeve, and it's very clear that he looks at these pieces with contempt. He cannot seem to fathom and understand why the ancient person would ever want to look at these subjects, let alone possess them as artworks. Um, or as literary subjects. And I think that stems from a desire in historical uses of the classics and archaeology to categorize people for a contemporary audience, such as to then justify practices such as eugenics. If I can use Egyptology as another example, Flinders Petrie, a man often seen as the father of scientific Egyptology, as scientific archaeology, had very deep ties with individuals like Carl Pearson and Francis Galton as well at UCL, who are obviously seen as the fathers of eugenics. And so he provided for them quite willingly a number of data sets, including mummified human remains, to create this idea, which he also then furthered as the idea of the dynastic race, the idea that there had to be a perfect Aryan race that ruled over the African subject in Egypt because there was simply no way that they could have achieved the wonders that they achieved. And within that, to bring it back to disability, there is this idea of the inherent strangeness of the disabled body and subject as part of that transaction. The idea that that the disabled body is there to be dominated and created. And so what that means, therefore, is that again, the disabled mind and body today is seen as something that is inherently weak and vulnerable. And that is just furthered by kind of retelling these stories, including in these literary narratives of disabled figures in the past, as someone who is inherently on the back foot, someone who is inherently vulnerable. And so, coming to it today, you want to say, well, no, I think there's more going on here. Is it always that they are on the receiving end, or are they kind of, is there a bit more of a transactional give and take here in these kind of social exchanges? Um, yeah.
Absolutely. I think I really appreciate, highlighting the kind of intersectional racial disability problems which have
Mm,
already come up today with Holly's piece, which is like, to be gendering is also to be racializing, and also to create this kind of idealized form of the body. Then civilizational narratives come into the
mm,
matter. One thing that I really appreciate hearing from you, and it's also something that is constantly vexing the discipline of classical studies, is this question of the dominance of a particular
mm,
kinds of work, right? So the big book that no one reads, but every academic who's really in the center of the metropole
mm,
has to produce for promotional
mm,
period, whatever. But you
mm,
yourself are working in public spaces, and so I
mm,
would love actually to hear more about how the work that you do has been actualized because of the idea of like just having a discourse with the public
mm,
rather than merely kind of in a sense there's a real danger on the one hand with academic work. We ought to and must absorb
mm,
and understand appropriately theories of gender, race, and
mm,
disability, but it can also become kind of clout chasing and a little
mm,
bit like against the purpose.
mm,
And then there's the fact that there's an entire population that is interested in
mm,
antiquity, Greece, Rome, Egypt, and these are
mm,
spaces where you yourself are a curator. So can you
mm.
tell us a bit more about how this works in a curatorial space or in a public space?
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that I've learned as a curator is, first of all, it's worth acknowledging, and I want to be very clear because I don't want to sound like I'm want to make myself seem like I've cracked the riddle, I've solved it, and that the museum itself doesn't uphold a lot of biases in and of itself by the nature of its collecting and by the nature of its display and its own histories. So there are plenty challenges that still exist in there. However, one of the greatest benefits that I found in doing curatorial work on disability in the public museum, in the public space, is that it gives me a greater opportunity to then invite disabled people in of many different backgrounds in to then access this material themselves. And therefore, the question therefore becomes less of just bluntly saying this is a disabled person who lived in the past and this is absolutely definitively how they must have lived or not lived, as the case may be, but about interrogating our own relationship with object and subject and understanding how framing that within a museum context as a story helps us to reflect on our own contemporary selves. So through a co-productive model with disabled people. So I did this both in Oxford, at both the Ashmolean Museum and the Pitt Rivers Museum, but also more recently at the Verulamium Museum in St Albans, which is a Roman archaeology museum. We were looking at how evidences for disabled people in the past, or even just lived experiences of the past, could be explored through a disabled person's lens. Because even if you cannot definitively point at a site and say that we know of a disabled person who lived in this space, knowing that the high likelihood of someone living with a disability in that space could have existed, how might that have been sensed and experienced? And so then talking to a contemporary person, with the caveat of understanding, of course, they can only speak from their contemporary experience, you can bridge a gap to then start to see where these material objects and subjects all of a sudden take on a new dimension. So if I was to give you an example, we mentioned earlier, well, you mentioned earlier the idea of the ancient prostheses, right? And how they have been quite quickly latched onto, understandably so, because they are quite fantastic material items in themselves, and they open the possibility for a lot of stories. But the actual understanding of how that feels to have a prosthetic and to use one, and what that means on a kind of reflective ontological level, so the sense of self, what does that mean? I don't think in scholarship, at least not that I've yet to see anyone with an actual lived experience of prosthetics look at these ancient materials and say, oh, that's an interesting thing, I wonder what that would have been like based on their own lived experience. Whereas in the curatorial space, I'm able to bring forward these items or these pictures of these items and say to them, well, here is what they are. And very often in the scholarship, the question that ends up being a bit of a brick wall is saying, but studies of these prosthetics have shown that they wouldn't really have had much practical use because, of course, again, we're looking at them from a lens of a contemporary prosthetic, which has a like-for-like mimetic objective in mind. They're supposed to replace the limb that has been lost. But in ancient prosthetics, and this is something that came out from these conversations with prosthetic users, is that perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the point is that this then fills not even a gap, but it fills a space that has now been fundamentally changed by whatever body altering experience a person may have had. And so then it changes our way of interpreting that object, not just as a like for like mimetic replacement, but as actually something of an exploration of the means of the body and what that represents. And so likewise, when looking at literature and looking at ancient myths, for example, which talk about the creation of the human body, and of course there are numerous examples of those, but I'll use one example from Mesopotamia, the Enuma Elish, which is all about the creation of the world and the creation of the universe. And within it, there's the incidental creation of humankind from the clay of the earth and the blood of a dead god. So all of a sudden, this idea of the chaotic energy that kind of envelops the human body, and the very first iteration of humankind that appears are people that we may describe today as being disabled. They don't have perfect symmetrical bodies. They are missing limbs. They have contorted features. And it's these kind of original humans that then form as the baseline for what comes after. And so when disabled people engage those stories, it opens up very interesting and very deep conversations about what it means to live through a divergent body minds, and therefore fundamentally what it is to be human. And I think those dialogues are very beneficial to a much wider human audience because this is something that we all contend with on an existential level. And so making space for that dialogue is really vital because then it shows that far from being an outlier to the human experience, these themes have been a core part of the development of culture and society across time, and therefore there is that space for us today to also continue to explore those questions.
Absolutely. This is a wonderful reminder of the fact that, whenever we are in these theoretical spaces, things which are, proposited as purely theoretical, and the belief is that it was invented yesterday. And I think this is a place where the ancient world study is very powerful.
Mm,
It's to help understand that these are historical, they're different. It's not trans-historically stable, but it's historical.
mm,
Um, so you've already touched on this in many ways, but I'll just ask the question for, what you feel like is a spark for another response, which is where might we apply this disability paradigm to our study of the ancient world?
mm. So I'll use a different example just very quickly. So one particular classical character that does come up a lot in discussions of disability is naturally the Greek god Hephaestus, obviously the god of creation, god of material creation, the god of the forge. For his appearance of sometimes embodying a congenital clubbed foot or some form of what is often derogatorily described as lameness in his legs. And I'll use him as an example because he's another one that sparks really interesting conversations, both with disabled people in public spaces, but also when you take a critical disability studies approach to him. And I use him as an example because I think very often you have at least in my personal experience as a disabled scholar, there is either this sort of dogged aversion to the idea of discussing him as a disabled god. How can a god be disabled? That doesn't make sense, right? And I'm not naming any names. I've been blocked by some people for that purpose.
Mm.
But others then also attach to him and see that disability identity within Hephaestus, and this is particularly true amongst disabled people. And noticeably, something that I discovered is within modern neo-pagan communities, a lot of disabled neo-pagans will take to Hephaestus for that reason. And I think when you take a disability paradigm to him, and especially not critique, when you look at the idea of metis, the idea of cunning and intellect, that's my understanding of it as a non-classicist, to Hephaestus's character, often when it's talked about the reasons for his embodiment and what that means for him is it could be just a reflection of the very disabling nature of blacksmithing, and it sure as hell sure could. However, I wonder whether it could be a reflection, and this is to bring in a disability studies approach. There's a wonderful book called Activist Affordances, and it's a medical anthropology work by an author who I'm very sorry, the name escapes me immediately, but it's a great book about how disabled people in the contemporary sense, often not having the adequate support structures in place by the state or by other means, come up with their own means of surviving. Yes, thank you, Nicolette. Um, Arseli Doku, Dokumaki. I probably butchered that name. I'm very sorry. Um, um, they come up with their own affordances. They make their own substitutes essentially through their own lived experience. And so I sometimes question and I wonder whether we should look at Hephaestus's embodiment of disability, of his clubfoot, and therefore his subsequent attribution of the creation of various what we could say are aids to his own working and to the working of the gods as that same sort of affordance. It's his lived experience and knowledge of that embodiment that gives him the ingenuity to work these solutions, and therefore I wonder in the Greek mind or in the classical mind whether they look at him as almost a expansion of that idea that they witness in the lives of those disabled people who did live, if that makes sense. So this is where these stories again, when you take them away from just a purely classical context and you bring them into dialogue with people with that lived experience, you see the sort of the conversations that that can spark and the inspiration that that gives. And so I find it really useful to take these things, and it's not to say definitively that that is what is going on, but when you open that door, that possibility, the sort of the enrichment and the social well-being that arises from that. I remember at the Ashmolean we did a day for families with disabled children at the Ashmolean. I gave them a little tour around the galleries, and we got to a crater of Hephaestus, and I told that story and the ways in which the children's eyes lit up at the idea that they could improvise and create new meanings for things and create new ways of doing things, and that this did not have to be the only way that their lives were going to be, immediately just changed seemingly on the spot how they felt about themselves and the ways in which they were doing things. So even small things like that can make a huge difference. And so this is where I think if we're a bit more playful with it and we
Mhm.
take these to our studies of ancient texts and to our knowledge of those things, that is beneficial to everyone, because then it gets us to think more deeply about how both the ancients and we ourselves are encountering our body minds and the ways in which we are rationalizing them, because they are the ones that we've got. And I think sometimes we can be a bit reductive again when looking at the evidence and saying, "Oh, that must have been hard." It's like, yeah, I'm sure it was, but carry on. I think we sometimes stop far too short, and we don't even allow our imagination to kind of go, well, clearly they lived, so let's follow that further. Let's go further.
This has been so wonderful, Kyle, and I'm glad that you have brought us to a close with this notion of improvisation and creativity, because this discussion we've been able to have demonstrates that we don't need to have necessarily a 30-minute paper written down all the way through to have a really rich and stimulating and inspiring conversation. So thank you so much for your work and
Thank you.
for sharing your thoughts today. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyle.